Okay, so what I wanted to give you generally today is I wanted to go over a brief overview of how IPM is done in California, because California is unsurprisingly one of the more regulated states in terms of everything, and agriculture counts in everything. So no surprises that IPM and pest control in general have a lot of structure to them. And it's kind of useful to get an overview of how all of that sits together. I'm sure some of you already have your PCA licenses. Some of you may have taken the exam and may have a general idea. But let's just go overall and get a general idea. So before we get going, just a reminder that we will be using the textbook IPM in Practice by Flint. So if you don't have a copy, I'd stop by the bookstore or order one online and get it pretty soon. This is what the lectures are based on. This is the book that the PCA exam is based off of, and it's pretty cheap. I found it at the bookstore for between $26 and $35, or $27 to $35 on Amazon. You can also go down to the Extension Center here in Fresno and buy it for $30 to $35, something in that range. So it's pretty inexpensive, pretty accessible, and really useful for studying for the exam and for the exams in this class. So, the central challenge in pest management. What we are ultimately trying to do as people working in agricultural systems managing pests is to create an environment that is unfavorable to the pest, but as beneficial to the crop as possible. And this can be a relatively challenging task to get to, because obviously we could create an environment that's entirely unfavorable to the pest by burning it to the ground and salting the earth, but ultimately that wouldn't do us much good in terms of crop production. So sometimes it's a little bit easy to, as people in my profession who are focused on the pest side, to sometimes forget about the crop, but it is important. And for that we have IPM. And just as a reminder, IPM is this ecosystem-based strategy focusing on long-term prevention through combinations of techniques, which range through all of the ones you generally hear about in your other plant health courses: biocontrol, habitat manipulation, resistant varieties, as well as pesticides, though admittedly with some caveats that pesticides are used if monitoring indicates that they need to be used, and that treatments should be ideally designed to only remove the target organism, not to harm our beneficials or insects that aren't really pests that aren't doing organisms that aren't doing anything bad in the environment. But then on top of that, IPM is also a decision-making system, helping us to identify pest infestations, select and integrate control tactics, identify effective controls, ultimately with the goal of reducing risk. So essentially, risks to the human health, risks to beneficials, and risks economically that farmers may be taking. So ultimately with the ideal of it also being cost-effective on top of all of this, and site-specific, unique to the agroecosystem, to the economic conditions, to the grower's resources. And so the point of listing this all out is just to really drive home the fact that the base knowledge that you're expected to have in order to perform IPM is really high. IPM is what we would consider very information intensive. In order to do it really well, you're expected to know a lot. On one hand, you're supposed to have a basic understanding of agronomics, how crops are raised, their physiology, essentially everything you need to get a crop in the ground all the way to harvest. On top of that, you need to have a firm understanding of plant health, what the pests are, how you monitor for them, how you treat them. And then finally, you need to have a really in-depth knowledge of these management techniques. What can you do to which crops? When do you apply them? How do you apply them? And on top of that, what is legal? What are you allowed to do? Because there's a lot of things you aren't in certain crops. So essentially, IPM is information intensive. And ultimately what this has done is it's basically developed a professional class of agricultural workers that focus on IPM, on pest control, whether they're researching it, regulating it, or implementing it. And essentially, it is their job 100% of the time to be doing this, because they are the professionals and they are in charge of making sure they have all that information. And in California, there are really three major groups that these fall into. They would be the pest control advisors, or the PCAs, which could be summarized as kind of being the boots on the ground, the people who are actually out there observing, monitoring, making recommendations. you've got the Department of Pesticide Regulation, which are the administrators or the regulators. They set the laws, they make the rules, they administer the tests. And then finally, we have the UC Statewide IPM Program, which would be something of the research wing of IPM, making sure that the techniques work and that, coming up with new systems for people, trying to create more efficient IPM. So what I'd like to do for the rest of the class, or at least for part of it, is to go through these three sections, give you a basic idea what each of them do, what the requirements are to sort of get into them or find out what they are working on. And we'll start out with PCAs, and then we'll move through the others in the order I presented them earlier. So, a PCA or a pest control advisor. According to the state of California, you are a PCA if you do one of these three things. Either you offer a recommendation on any agricultural use of pest control product or technique. So basically, if you go out to a field and you look at somebody's field, you see they have an aphid problem, and you recommend an insecticidal soap or something, then you just became a PCA in that very moment because you recommended that they control that pest in some way. You can also be a PCA if you present yourself as an authority on any ag use of a certain product. So you don't even need to make the recommendation. If you're just out there saying that you know all about this stuff, then you could be a PCA. Or if you solicit services or sales for any agricultural product or technique. So if you're a sales representative for an agrochemical company, then you would technically fall under the heading of PCA according to California law. And that could mean an awful lot because PCAs are highly regulated. In order to be a PCA, you need to have a PCA license from the Department of Pesticide Regulation, which requires a fair bit of classwork and a demonstrated proficiency in integrated pest management. So essentially, you need to take enough classwork to qualify to take the exam, and then after you have it, you have to keep on taking classes in order to maintain it, right? So, and as I said earlier, ultimately what these PCAs do is they act as the boots on the ground. They're the ones who basically go out and scout, see what's going on. They write the written recommendations, so they ultimately control what is being applied at any given time. And ideally, these PCAs are making these decisions, are writing these recommendations with integrated pest management in mind. While they may not be explicitly required to do that, with all the training and the emphasis the DPR is putting on this, it's implied that IPM is something that should be at the forefront of a PCA's thinking. So exemptions. There are cases where you don't need a PCA license to apply control techniques. Three of them specifically. One, you can belong to one of these groups. You can be an official in a federal, state, or county Department of Agriculture. So if you work for the USDA, you can go out there and make recommendations, and you don't need a PCA license. Similarly, you can work for the University of California, or you could be basically a property owner working on your own property. So basically, if you're a grower, and you're growing your own crop, you can go out there and make your own recommendations. You don't need a PCA license to do that. I guess there's two, excuse me. And the second alternative is that you don't need a PCA license if you're making any recommendations that aren't agricultural use. So basically, you can do pest control in a system that's not agricultural and you don't need a license. So things like structural pests, that's managed by the Structural Pest Control Board. So if you're out there inspecting a school, you don't really need the PCA license. Animal pests, so veterinary people are regulated by the Veterinary Medical Board. They don't need a PCA license. And also, if you're just doing any application in your house, in an industrial setting, institutions like the California state, like if they wanted to apply pesticides here in our buildings, those are people who wouldn't need PCA licenses. They're all held exempt. So essentially, on the flip side, if you were applying pesticides to a golf course, that's technically considered agriculture. It is plants, it is outside. And so there are some unusual sort of wiggle rooms. Actually, don't quote me on the golf course, but I do know that essentially a rule of thumb is that if the insect or the pest is hurting a plant, then you're going to count it as agricultural.
What if you're getting recommendations for the use of pesticide from someplace like Lowe's to use in your yard?
Oh, that's a good question. I believe that would fall under home use, so they don't require a PCA license to do that.
And they're not liable.
Yeah, they're not liable. Liability is, yeah, sort of a big factor in the PCA. We'll talk about that in a little bit further down. Any other questions about this list? All right. But yeah, if you went to Lowe's and they recommended what to do for your almonds, then one, you probably shouldn't go to Lowe's.
Yeah.
Well, that's where most people are going to go. I mean,
Oh, it's true, exactly.
They're going to go to Lowe's. And, a lot of home gardeners will produce like 20 or 30 tomato plants in their backyard. I got aphids.
Yeah, exactly.
What do I need?
Exactly. Yeah. No, you're right. They would go. But yeah, I think at that scale, it's so small they don't consider it to be sort of a commodity. That would be interesting because you can get sued, right, as a PCA if it's not, if you make a recommendation that harms the plant. I like the idea. I don't like the idea, but it strikes me as funny. If some home grower comes in and sues some guy at Lowe's for the value of 20 tomato plants.
Well, there could be some ecological damage.
No, there could be, exactly.
So there's other consequences just besides damaging your backyard property.
That's true. That is true. Well, and I think that they specifically put in the home industrial and institutional to avoid that kind of problem, so Lowe's wouldn't have to employ a PCA to make their sales in pesticides. So how do you become a PCA? Well, as I mentioned earlier, to become a PCA, first off, you have to be licensed by the Department of Pesticide Regulation. And the first real requirement to even get that licensure is you have to meet the minimum education requirements. So there are 3 different routes that you can use to get that requirement. The first of which is you can get a bachelor's degree in an agricultural field, which would be the route that most of you are taking at this very moment. Congratulations on your, well, this isn't your very first step, but one of many steps on the way.
You have to go to a PhD yesterday.
Sorry?
I thought you said you have to get a PhD yesterday on the slides.
Oh, it does, but that's a little further down. So the bachelor's degree is the first option. So essentially, if you have a bachelor's degree in one of these 4 sections, basically ag science, natural science, I have never seen a bachelor's degree in pest management. I don't know what that would be, but who knows? Maybe they have them. And you have to meet those requirements for a certain number of core courses, have a little bit of work experience, and maintain at least a C grade average across all those courses. I had a student just recently who wanted to know if they had to have a 2.0 in every single class or if it was averaged across all of their classes. And we emailed the DPR and found out that it's averaged across all of your classes. I believe that the only course that you're required to have a C or higher in is this one. So technically you need at least a C in your IPM class. Beyond that, you could potentially get a D and it would still count as long as the rest of your classes pull you up. Yes?
So on option number 1, you do need work experience still, even if you get the degree?
Work experience letter. That's a good question. It says a letter. I'm not exactly sure what that spells out. Yes? No.
Not if you have your degree. If you don't have your degree, like if you go to a JC, I believe you have to have work experience.
Oh, okay, sure. Okay. So it sounds like work experience isn't required if you have the degree. I'm not sure what they mean by letter there, or if that just means you can submit a letter for work experience. It's also possible that you can take the exam before you have your degree if you have all the classwork, and maybe the letter's a way that you can do that before the degree is officially conferred. I know every year we do this IPM class, there's usually at least one person who wants to take the exam immediately after they have the IPM because it's the last required credit they needed, in which case the university writes a special letter saying they passed it, they just don't have their degree yet. All right, any questions about the bachelor route? All right, so fortunately, CSU Fresno, or Fresno State as everybody normally calls it, you can tell I wrote this slide when I first got here and I was trying to figure out, do you just say Fresno State all the time? Or is it CSU Fresno? But anyway, Fresno State has a class schedule specifically spelled out to allow you to reach this requirement. And so essentially, this is the nice DPR sheet that spells out every single step that is required. One thing that should be noted is that you can take any of the classes within these major categories, whether it's crop health, physical biology, life sciences, or production systems. There's only one course that's absolutely required, and it is at least one course emphasizing IPM principles. Hence, Plant Health 108 is required, and you're all here. Option 2, if you want to take the exam, you can have a PhD like I do. So, you need a PhD in agricultural, biological, natural science, or pest management. Again, I don't know any PhDs in pest management, but who knows? I've just never seen that program before. There's no core courses. You don't need any work experience. You don't need a great grade point average. If you have a PhD, you can take the exam. So I could rush out, and I could take my PCA exam test right now. I'll probably take it over the summer just because I want to see what it's like. But, you know, what it comes down to is I could probably advise on insects, but the moment anything else is put in front of me, I'd be a little suspect. So, you know, all the PhDs are lining up and saying, finally, I can take my PCA exam. The challenge here, of course, is that most people don't go this route because even Kermit the Frog has a PhD. It doesn't necessarily qualify him to be a PCA. Okay, and then the third option, you can get work experience. So this is for people who have been in the field for a long time, don't necessarily have the bachelor's degree, but want to get the PCA license anyway. They have a lot of on-the-ground experience and probably could do the job pretty well. So for this, you don't need a college degree, but you do need a certain number of credits. You would normally go to a community college, or you would enroll part-time at a university to get these. And you need to have 24 months combined of work experience. So something we hear sometimes is students want to take their PCA exam early because they have work experience. They've been working for some company for 2 years. It's like a summer intern. That doesn't count as 24 months. It needs to be 24 months of actually doing the job, not 24 months of being hired but only working summers, right? So great for people who have been in the industry. It's all really nicely spelled out, so you can be out there inspecting and be well on your way to taking the PCA exam. All right, so second part. Once you have met those education requirements, you need to actually pass a series of exams. There's 3 major categories. There are 2 that you have to pass right off the bat, laws and regulations and basic IPM. Those 2 are usually combined into a single test. I believe it's 200 questions, sort of a multiple choice type deal. And then finally, you also have to pass at least 1 pest category exam. So there are 7 different pest categories that you can take the exam for. The insects, plant pathogens, nematodes, vertebrates, weed control defoliants, and plant growth regulators. And consequently, if you pass all these exams, you get your license, and the license will spell out on the back which license category tests you passed. If you haven't passed a certain test, you can't make recommendations regarding that, right? So if you, for whatever reason, don't pass the defoliation, or let's say you don't take the defoliation exam, you don't expect that you're ever going to work in cotton. So if someone comes out and they want you to write them a recommendation for a defoliant, you legally can't do that because you didn't pass that test. You don't have that letter on your PCA license, right? So you could legally become a PCA by just taking those 2 tests and the insects, but you won't be able to work on anything other than insect systems. All right. Oh, well, I just said that. So PCAs may make recommendations in any category that they have a license, but regardless of which categories you do pass, you are expected to be proficient in IPM. That is the basic test that you have to take, as well as regulations. And the DPR has a nice little study guide about IPM that basically outlines everything they expect you to know. So once you have passed the test and you have your license, you still have to retain it. And to do so, you basically, reason is that things are always changing, and PCAs are expected to keep up to date on all of this, and so you need to renew the PCA license every 2 years, and you do so by taking at least 40 hours of continuing education credits to renew those hours, including 4 hours mandatory of laws and regulations. So there's all sorts of classes that are offered in order to get these sort of credits. Most of them are run through CAPCA, or the California PCA Association. Right? So as far as information is concerned, if you're interested in this and you want to learn a little bit more, licensing info, application form, and study guides are all on the DPR website. They're all very clearly spelled out, which is nice. They're pretty quick with emails if you have questions as well. And then CAPCA, which is the California Association of Pest Control Advisors. They're very essentially interested in maintaining a good environment for PCAs in California, so they have lots of materials as well. All right, so what do PCAs actually do? Well, as a PCA, the number one marketable thing that you have is that you are essentially a pest management expert. You have all of that intensive information that you need to do by-the-books pest control in California. And so essentially, the main service is that you go out and you lend your expertise. You're expected to know things. And so you're up to date on all the most recent techniques. You can identify and monitor. You're aware of the environmental regulations that are around pesticides. And so essentially, you're there to provide the grower with peace of mind. In addition, you're also offering services in the line of sort of keeping an eye on where their fields are through monitoring such things as keeping regular bookkeeping of what they have in the field, estimating population changes, interpretations of where they are going, just sort of generally keeping an eye out. The other primary service that PCAs really do is they have the written recommendation. This is probably the most typical service, the one that PCAs are most known for providing. It's essentially a prescription from a doctor, right? Growers can't really apply anything if they don't own the land, if it's sort of a big conglomerate. And most growers, honestly, are in a position where they're focused on so many things, they'll gladly pay for the peace of mind of having a PCA take care of all of this and take the liability on themselves, rather than the growers having to worry about it. And so they'll take a PCA, you write the prescription, and then ultimately the growers can't even hire an applicator to apply whatever it is you suggest unless they have that. And then finally, the final service really that PCAs offer is pesticide use reporting. So in California, anytime you apply pesticide, you have to report it to the DPR. They keep all those records around. Since PCAs are usually writing the recommendation, they'll oftentimes also write up these reports and keep them for, I believe it's 2 years minimum that you're required to keep them. And so this includes all sorts of things that aren't necessarily what we consider traditional pesticides, things like soaps, microbials, and even mating disruptants. So putting out pheromones counts as a registered application that you need to have a report for.
Is
So-
that because it's part of IPM and making recommendations for pest control is supposed to be reported? Because we're not using a pesticide.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not necessarily a pesticide, but I believe it is because it is in line with IPM. It's in line with something that is related to pesticides, since mating disruptant is technically a chemical you're putting out into the environment to control a pest. So even though it doesn't kill them, it kind of sits on that borderline of what is a pesticide and what isn't. All right. Oh, and finally, PCAs oftentimes are expected to do independent research, because oftentimes there's lots of products that are coming out that you necessarily don't know a whole lot about, your growers don't know about. You might have some industry rep telling you about how great they are, but they might have a vested interest in selling you a product. And so lots of PCAs oftentimes will maintain their own trials. They'll set up blocks and apply new techniques, new pesticide, new cultivation techniques or varieties in order to see how well they work. And so PCAs are expected to have at least a bare sort of minimum level of research capability. And that's why in the lab we're kind of focusing a little bit on scientific thinking, scientific writing, and running through field trials. All right, so PCAs and liability. PCAs are considered to be experts in the field and assume all legal responsibility for their written recommendations. to a certain extent, verbal recommendations. Essentially, if you are a PCA and you recommend a pest management practice and it doesn't work, or if the spray damages a crop, then you may be held liable for all of the damage that it causes. And if you're talking about several acres of almond or citrus, that may be a lot of money right off the bat, probably more money than you have laying around. So consequently, PCAs are required to keep all parties informed of the risks, benefits, and recommendations of their recommendations, and they are required to keep all of their recommendations on hand in order to limit their liability. Consequently, when you see these written recommendations, they're oftentimes like, 80 pages thick, with all of sort of the legalese around making sure that the recommendations are being followed. And for this reason, most PCAs carry liability insurance, which is sort of the equivalent of malpractice coverage if you're a doctor. If you make a mistake, then essentially you're held liable for it. Your insurance will pick up the tab for you, ideally, if you are at fault. Consequently, there's all sorts of interesting little cottage industries around this. I was talking to a Fresno State grad, and she's an agricultural investigator. She gets hired by these insurance companies to go out and investigate cases where a crop has been damaged or they have a loss of yield. It's her job to figure out who's at fault for that. I bumped into her because she needed a sweep net, and they had a ligus problem in some alfalfa up in Oregon. And it was a question of whether the grower hadn't applied in time despite what the recommendation suggested. It turned out that it was the grower at fault, and so the person who had made the recommendation ended up getting out of their insurance having to pay it off. All right, so that's just an aside. So the DPR. DPR is a branch of the California EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, and they're in charge of a lot of things, primarily all around, pesticide regulation, as you would expect from the name. They evaluate all pesticides in California, and they regulate whether or not they are accepted. That's why oftentimes if you look at pesticide labels, they'll have a section for application in California and New York, and then a section that's like applications everywhere else, because sometimes the California DPR is a little bit more restrictive than the US EPA is, or the USDA in their recommendations. They do environmental monitoring, so they monitor the water and the air for pesticides that are getting leaked out into those, and they also enforce all the pesticide laws, as well as test for residues on crops. And then finally, as we mentioned earlier, they're also in charge of the licensure for all of these PCAs that are running around. So ultimately, you can think of them as just being the chief administrators of all pest control techniques. They're there to create incentives and grants for people to perform IPM. So oftentimes they will create regulations in order to essentially sort of further IPM, such things as banning a lot of fumigants that have been used in methyl bromide for so long, as well as determining the materials for the PCA exams. So they're kind of in charge of determining what is IPM and how do we want IPM to be carried out in California. And then finally, we have the UC Statewide IPM system. So back in 1979, well, actually 20 years before that, in 1959, really the first seeds for IPM were planted with a paper that was published by some UC guys who were interested in pest control and how we could do it more efficiently and not end up killing all our biocontrol. About 20 years later, the UC system had really been investigating this new thing that they were calling IPM, and the state decided, well, let's just create a whole wing in the extension system that is in charge of this IPM, and so that they can actually coordinate their efforts and come up with something that would be beneficial to the state. And so they created the statewide IPM system. And ultimately, the IPM system was mandated to, one, increase the predictability and the effectiveness of pest control techniques. So they were to figure out when would be, effectiveness and predictability would essentially be figuring out when do you apply pest techniques, figuring out how to quantify what is a certain resistant plant, what is not a resistant plant, basically setting it up so that the growers know exactly what they need to do to get the results they expect instead of guessing. So taking a lot of the guesswork out. Developing pest control programs that are economically, environmentally, and socially acceptable. So one of the big parts of IPM that we talked about already. Increasing the utilization of natural pest controls. So they were supposed to really push forward maintaining biocontrol. And then also prolonging the useful period for pesticides by minimizing resistance. So a big part of this was how do we stop resistance from developing and keep these pesticides around for a long time. And so you could think of it as basically the research wing of California IPM. They develop new techniques, and then they disseminate that information out to growers through the growers and PCAs through the extension system. Hence, all the extension offices that are around and are so willing to answer questions because that's their jobs. Consequently, it's not just through the extension offices. UC IPM has a super handy website for some of the better understood crops, the ones that have been studied really, really well. You have tons of information. This is just for the almonds. You can see that essentially they've got up at the top emerging pests, the research that's going on and stuff that seems relatively new. They've got a year-round IPM program, so you can click on that and it tells you what you can be doing to watch out for pests, treat for pests at this exact moment in the life stage of the crop. And then they just have general information. They have websites, they've got information sheets on basically every single conceivable pest that you have. For this particular crop, we've got a weather model and degree days, so you can calculate out where you expect pests to be in their developmental stages, the pesticides that you're allowed to apply, tons of information. Conceivably, any question you have about pest control has at least some bit of information on the UC IPM site, because they've got a lot of people working around the clock to solve these problems. So, lastly, I just wanted to cover what is some of the impact that IPM has had. Because obviously, since at least the 1970s, California has been heavily invested in making IPM happen. So it's kind of this question, has IPM really done any good for California? Are we better off now than we were before we started? Consequently, there were 2 studies just published by Jim Farrar. He's the director of UC IPM and the former plant pathology professor here at Fresno State that I mentioned in the first lecture, just published in the last 2 years. And basically, he looked at California and Arizona because they are the only 2 states that have the PCA system mandated, the only 2 states that keep reports on when pesticides are applied. And he just looked at a short period, 1995 to 2012, and was really asking questions of, do we see IPM improving the quality of our crops and the quality of our pest control during that time period? Are things getting better in terms of the amount of pesticides we apply, whether we're applying super toxic ones, whether we're finding residues on food, and additionally, oh, I didn't put it on there, but additionally a big part of it was, with all of this reductions in pesticides, are we still seeing increases in yield and quality of crops? So looking at Arizona, they found some interesting numbers, which was that active ingredient of insecticide applied to cotton reduced. Oh, I see, I wrote that confusingly. The main point is that they reduced the active ingredient applied to cotton 91%. So that's a 91% reduction in the total amount of pesticide applied. And now, 76% of the pesticide applied to that cotton are selective, meaning that they are targeted at pests and don't hurt biocontrol. And so that's a huge increase in sort of basically protecting natural resources in the terms of biocontrol. And further, they showed that total pesticide sprays in lettuce had decreased 5 times. They reduced from greater than 10 sprayings in 1995 down to less than 2.5 in 2011. And they also showed that they had the largest reduction in some of these broad spectrum insecticides, such as organophosphates, endosulfate, carbamates. Those were the categories that took the greatest dip and again saw more of an increase in reduced risk pesticides. So what we've got here is the lettuce sprays. So these again are the broad spectrums. Here we see the broad spectrum decrease over time and the increase in the reduced risk pesticides. Consequently, they also found that there was no drop-off in production during this change, no increase in pest damage to the crops. So they managed to maintain quality while reducing pesticide applications. In California, the story is a little bit more complicated. From 1995 to 2012, we saw a general reduction, although you can see it's not a really clear pattern. While there was a 10% reduction, things go up, things go down, we see little bumps and peaks. And so what we've got here is just the total pounds of active ingredient applied in California by year. However, what Jim realized was that when he started crunching the numbers, that total productivity in California went up astronomically during this period. So it's kind of a question of, can we look at just the raw active ingredient being applied if the crops that we're growing right now are substantially different? Back in 95, California was growing a lot more crops that were lower value commodities, things that you could, for the most part, they were crops where basically per dollar of value you were spraying more pesticides on them, as opposed to the transition they eventually made towards a lot of tree fruits and stone fruits and things like that that have higher value per spray. And so essentially what he asked was, well, instead of linking the amount of active ingredient just to the number of sprays we have, what if we look at how active ingredient applied relates to total dollar value of crop? And so what he demonstrated was that essentially, if we look at pounds of active ingredient per $1,000 of production in California, we actually see a 56% reduction in total pesticides. So essentially, for every dollar that we get out of agriculture, we're spending 56 cents less on pesticide than we were in 1995. So going from an average of 8.6 pounds per $1,000 down to 3.9. So essentially, for the money we're getting out of agriculture, we're applying less pesticides. Further, we are seeing reductions. Here we've got, again, pounds of active ingredient by year. We're seeing reductions in the total number of chemicals that cause reproductive toxicity. We see reduction in groundwater polluting pesticides over that period of time. But it's not all good news. We basically held steady at carcinogenic pesticides, so pesticides that are known to cause cancer. They're still pretty high, though admittedly, part of this is how things are categorized. Technically, an oil is carcinogenic. So if you're applying sort of a winter spray of oil to an almond crop, that counts as a carcinogenic insecticide. Though admittedly, those oils are so highly refined, it's really questionable whether they are truly carcinogenic or not. So that's up for debate, but that's the way it's categorized. And we still see a fair number of toxic air contaminants in California as well. So with that, that's about all I've got for you. So that's IPM in California. As you can see, 3 major wings and sort of a general trend towards less pesticides, having a less dangerous environment, but still maintaining really excellent crop productivity. Just a reminder, if you're in lab today, we're going to be out in the almonds. It looks like fate has smiled upon us and we're not going to get rained on the whole time. So that's nice. Again, I should have a van, so if you want to meet up with me about 10 minutes before lab, so 1:50, I can give you a ride. All right? See you in lab or see you on Tuesday.